Back to the main lecture, and today we are going to start the English lectures, and that is basically we are going to start from the chapter number 3, that is range of motion. So in this context we can first discuss the introduction of the range of motion. After that we can discuss the types of range of motion exercises, indications and goals, limitations of range of motion exercises, like what kind of limits a passive motion has, or active motion has, or active assisted motion has. And after that, basically, we can discuss the precaution and contraindication that are required, or that we have to take consciously aware meant for a range of motion exercises, principle and procedures, like how you can apply the range of motion techniques, examination, evaluation, planning, patient preparation, and after that application and the techniques. After that you can discuss the different basically techniques, like how we can perform the range of motion on the upper extremity, lower extremity, cervical spine, lumbar spine, and the combined patterns of the motion. Self-assisted range of motion, you can just discuss that how you can itself assist yourself to perform any kind of range of motion, and you can tell your patients like how they can perform easily at their home plan. And continuous passive motion, basically it is a mechanical device that we can use to give range of motion, passive range of motion, so that patient we can just give the post-operative patients, or you can post-traumatic patients. So this also has a many kind of benefits, because there are certain cases you cannot give the patients this mechanic manual um, range of motion, or you can say that the passive range of motion. So in that case you cannot give yourself, so you can use any of the mechanical device. And other than that, range of motion through functional patterns, you can discuss all of that. Okay, we are going to discuss everything. So starting from the very first, the introduction, it is basically range of motion is a basic technique. Okay, it is a fundamental concept in movement science and rehabilitation, both in cases. Okay, so understanding range of motion is essential for assessing joint function, like how you can design any of the therapeutic intervention, treatment planning, and after that you can preventing how you can prevent any of the further mobility impairments, or you cannot go towards, or you can prevent patient from going towards any of the mobility impairments. Okay, so the major concept here is the basic introduction, starting from the basic definition. After that we can go towards the factors, types, and functional excursions, active and passive insufficiency, and how we can maintain range of motion. Okay, so range of motion itself refers to the full movement potential of a joint. Okay, so full movement potential of joint, or a muscle during functional activities. That means if you can perform the shoulder flexion and the complete range of, or you can say the complete range of motion of the shoulder flexion in 160 to 180 degree. So if it lies between them, that means the range of motion is performed in a very you can say that in a very comprehensive manner. You can say that this is the good way of representing the range of motion. But if the range of motion lies below that, so that means the range of motion is not completely performed. There are some kind of restrictions that are present in performing that kind of range of motion, because if that lies into 120 to 130 degree angle, there must be some kind of restriction or tightness in the muscles, or any joint mobility, any joint issues, or you can say any joint deformity, injuries, or muscular injuries. So these are the basic restrictions that we can face during performing the range of motion. And if human can perform a complete range of motion, if a person can perform easily complete range of motion 160 to 180 degree. So 160 to 180 degree is the normal shoulder flexion. Okay. So if there are certain restrictions that causes the decrease in that range of motion, or you can say there is a reduction in that range of motion, so that you can consider there might be some causes that are lying behind that decrease in the range of motion. Okay. So the key component in movement is basically range of motion. Okay, you can assess with that, you can treat with that. Everything you can perform is basically importance, or you can importance is basically importance of range of motion is majorly the key component in both the assessment and the in treatment planning. You can just assess using the range of motion, as we have discussed, as we are going to discuss in a later stages, and you can treat also with the range of motion if you can know the normal values as well as you can know the abnormal ranges. Okay, so movement itself occurs due to muscle activity or the external forces, as we have known, acting on the bone in various motion patterns. If patient can perform flexion, that means there are some kind of restriction you can face, and that might be external, because external forces, what kind of external forces? Maybe the tight clothing itself, the external force. Okay, there might be any other thing. Okay, any equipments or anything that patient that is going to use or are using. And muscle activity itself, as we have discussed, there are tightness in any kind of muscle, so that is also causing the muscle activity reduction. Okay, range of motion helps maintain joint mobility, muscle flexibility, and the function movement. So that means joint is basically mobile. If you can perform the range of motion exercises, the patient flexibility can improve and also the functional movement. Flexibility majorly target of the stretching, but some kind of flexibility is going to increase, because if you can increase the patient range from 120 to 140, that means you have increasing the muscle flexibility, because the major thing that is going to affect here is muscle itself, because there are muscle tightness present in this region. Okay, so when you can improve the you can decrease the muscle tightness and the range 120 increases from 120 to 140 degree, so that means you have increased the muscle flexibility. Okay, so majorly the stretching itself is working on this position, muscle range of motion is not, but some kind of maintenance is given with the range of motion exercises. Okay, so there are major factors that influence range of motion, that is basically the joint structure itself, soft tissue flexibility, neuromuscular control, and the injury or disease. Okay, you can just write it down. Joint structure, soft tissue flexibility, neuromuscular control, and injury or disease. Okay, so starting from the very first, joint structure itself, the anatomical shape or integrity of bone. Individual to individual, everything is going to vary. Okay, so if one person has some kind of anatomical restriction, maybe that person doesn't have. Okay, so you can just understand the basic structure of that person, then you can say that they both, if you can perform the both sides of shoulder flexion, and the shoulder flexion is reaches 160 to 180 degree, or less than 160 degree. Okay, so you can just say that there might be chance that there are tissue restriction, but majorly there are some kind of anatomical restriction as well. Okay, after that you can say that the soft tissue flexibility, like tightness, as we have discussed before, tightness in muscles, ligaments, tendons, fascia, anything like that that impacts the movement. Okay, because these are the structure that surrounds the your joint. Okay, your bones. So after that, neuromuscular control, because nervous system is basically the major component. Central nervous system regulates the movement coordination, so that means there might be chances that neuromuscular control itself can affect range of motion in that patient. After that, injury and disease, as we have discussed, arthritis, neurological conditions, stroke-like condition, muscular diseases, anything like that can affect the range of motion. Okay, so there are type of measurements you can take. Okay, first you can, if you can check the joint range of motion, we can use the goniometer, as we have discussed in a previous stage where you can say then the previous lectures, that goniometer itself can is a basically an equipment like a scale, and you can just one has a fixed arm and other is the moving arm. You can just place the fixed arm on the fixed part of your body and your moving arm on the moving part, and you can just record it these degrees. So it can basically help you out to detect the patient flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, rotation, range of motions, easily. Okay, so you can just measure joint range of motion with the help of goniometer. After that, muscle range of motion, that is basically measured with the help of function excursion. Okay, here is you can see that the term used here is function excursion. Function excursion is basically refers to a distance a muscle can shorten after being fully elongated. We can discuss this with the help of one example, that is short elbow flexion. Okay, sorry, elbow extension. First, you can put your arm in a complete elbow flexion, that is 0 degree, as we have no elbow extension. Okay, complete 0 degree. After that, you can just perform a elbow flexion. So when you can perform the elbow flexion, muscle can complete a certain kind of distance. That is basically the function excursion. And there, if there are some kind of restriction that you can feel in this case, that means the function excursion is itself factor. Okay, there are other factors that affect the function excursion, that is basically the muscle itself, or you can say the muscle crossing the joints. Okay, like if the muscle crosses the two joints itself, so that means there are certain kinds of disadvantages in this case. Okay, but if the muscle can uh, cross on one joint at a time, so there might be some certain kind of limitation. Okay, but if the muscle can cross two joints, like two joint or multiple joint, so there are two kind of restrictions. Here you can see the active insufficiency and the passive insufficiency. Okay, so active insufficiency and passive insufficiency is basically the two terms that you have to understand in a very depth. Okay, so we can take one example and we can discuss this. Okay, you can take a biceps brachii example. You know that the bicep brachii is a muscle that is basically the two joint or multi joint muscle. So active insufficiency, what happened here is basically in active insufficiency, the muscle is fully shortened, that it cannot further shorten, or you can say that it cannot contract further. So that means there are no further contraction, no further shortening. So if you can perform it in a very well way, you can say, for starting from the elbow flexion, you can just perform the elbow flexion. After that, you can perform the shoulder flexion. So when you can perform both of them together, it reaches a point where you cannot further shorten that muscle. So that means that has some insufficiency in performing the shortening. So that they called as active insufficiency. But passive insufficiency is completely the opposite of this. Okay, we have discussing here the shorting. Now the passive insufficiency is complete elongation, or you can say that the complete stretching. When you can extend both of them together, like extending the elbow and extending the shoulder together, it reaches some certain point that you cannot further perform, or you cannot further elongate a muscle, or you cannot further stretch a muscle, so that it reaches the passive insufficiency. So that is basically you can understand this easily, that what is flexing and what is extending. Okay, if the flexion causes the further shortening of the muscle, that means you cannot, or at the end of the shortening, you cannot furthermore shorten that muscle. That means that is some kind of active insufficiency is present there. If the joint crosses two or more joints. Okay, sorry, if the muscle crosses two or more joints. But in the same way, when you can extend both of areas, or you can say that the elbow and shoulder together, so that it reaches the complete elongation. After that, you cannot elongate or increase the length of the muscle. You cannot increase or further stretch the length of the muscle. That is basically the passive insufficiency. Okay, so these are the two disadvantages that you can face if the muscle joints, if the muscle crosses two or more joints. Okay, so there are certain importance of maintaining range of motion, because we have to prevent the further loss of range of motion. We can just take an example of the stroke patient. You have seen the stroke patient if someone have. So stroke patient can is a completely bedridden. Okay, so it has multiple immobilization diseases. It has multiple muscular diseases, neurological, joint, systemic. There are many kind of diseases that are working on that patient at a time. Okay, so we need to prevent further increase a loss of the range of motion. Okay, what is basically the patient loses before starting any of the exercises, it's something else. Okay, but we have to conquer that at a time. With that we have to prevent further loss of the range of motion. Okay, that means we have to treat that range of motion that patient is already lost, and we have to prevent the further loss of range of motion, or we have to prevent the patient cannot further increase in that reduction. Okay, so you have to work daily, you have to work regularly on the joint, on the soft tissues, so basically you can improve or maintain the range of motion. Okay, there are certain factors that we have discussed: diseases itself, neurological, muscular, systemic, any kind of, okay, that can affect the range of motion or decrease the range of motion. Other than that, there are many surgical traumatic injuries also decreases the range of motion. With that, inactivity, immobilization, like bedridden patient has some kind of casting like POP, external fixators, internal fixators, any kind of, okay. What that patient is, if the patient has some kind of prolonged sitting or any of these things, that is basically causing the decrease in the range of motion. Okay, so you have to discuss every point in a bit by bit manner. Okay, so therapeutic benefits of range of motion, as we have know that it can maintain joint and soft tissue mobility, prevent contractures. Contractures are the very important complication that we have discussed in stroke patients, because if the person cannot reaches the physical therapist in early stages, so that means patient can basically, or you cannot mobile the patient in the early stages of stroke, so patient can develop a contractures in the later stages, and loss of flexibility itself is a very detrimental. And after that, if patient can develop a contractures, you cannot reverse the condition in a very early stages of the stroke. You have to give treatment more than 6 months to 1 year to reduce that contractures and improve the patient flexibility. But that is some other kind of. We can just discuss range of motion, so we have to prevent the contractures or loss of flexibility in these cases. Okay. After that, tissue healing itself, like surgical or traumatic cases, so you can also enhance the tissue healing. So there, these are the major factors that can we have discussed here, and we have discussed before that stretching is something else and range of motion is something else. Stretching basically improves the flexibility and mobility, but range of motion is basically maintaining the mobility. Okay, so flexibility improvement is something else. You can just stretch or elongate a muscle, but range of motion in itself just to perform a normal available range. You cannot further increase that available range like 160 to 180 degree. If patient normally reaches 160 to 180 degree, you just work on that mobility. You cannot further improve the flexibility until or unless you can just stretch the muscle to the area. You can just improve their flexibility. Okay, so these are the major factors. So we have discussed here now today that range of motion is an essential component, function, movement, and rehab. For the functional movement and rehabilitation, there are certain factors that affect like joint structure, soft tissue integrity, neuromuscular control, everything like that influences the range of motion. And joint range of motion is measured with the goniometer, and muscle range of motion is measured by the or determined by the functional exertion. We have discussed the concept of active and passive insufficiency, and you have to retain this in your memory because this is an important concept. After that, regular range of motion exercises, that is basically prevent mobility loss and aid in tissue healing. And range of motion is different from stretching and joint mobility. So thanks for watching. If you have any queries, you can ask in the comment section, and hope so this can be a very good lecture, because English is my second language, not the first. So there might be certain kind of issues you can face while discussing this lecture. So thanks for watching. If you have any queries, you can ask.